Imagine standing in a field. It's November. The temperature is just above freezing, and the fog is so thick you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. Somewhere out there, in that white void, are thousands of men who want to kill you. You hear the drums first, deep, rhythmic, getting louder. Then you see them, shapes emerging from the mist, imperial musketeers, closing fast, their weapons already leveled. You have one shot, and then, if you survive it, you have to reload in the old way. That means fumbling with a powder horn, measuring loose black powder by feel and memory, fishing a lead ball from a separate pouch, ramming everything down a barrel with shaking hands while men are dying around you. That process takes 3 to 4 minutes on a calm day at the range. On a battlefield soaked in fear and blood and smoke, it might as well take forever. But you're not loading the old way. You reach into your bandolier, pull out a small paper tube, bite the end off with your teeth, and pour everything, powder, ball, and paper, straight down the barrel in one motion. Ram it. Done. 30 seconds. And that difference, that tiny, almost laughably simple difference, is about to change the face of European warfare forever. We're talking about the paper cartridge. And if you think this is a story about a piece of paper, you are underestimating it in the most spectacular way possible. The 30 Years' War had been tearing Europe apart since 1618. What began as a religious argument, Protestant versus Catholic, Reform versus Rome, inside the crumbling bureaucracy of the Holy Roman Empire had metastasized into something far uglier and far larger. Armies marched, cities burned, populations collapsed. By the time the 1620s gave way to the 1630s, the death toll in some regions of Central Europe had reached levels that would not be seen again until the 20th century. The Protestant cause, which had seemed so defiant and righteous at the war's outset, was faltering badly. The Catholic imperial forces, commanded by brilliant and ruthless generals, had systematically dismantled Protestant resistance across the German states. Something had to change. Someone had to arrive. That someone was Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He was 35 years old in 1630 when he landed in Pomerania with 18,000 troops and an agenda that went far beyond religious solidarity. History would call him the Lion of the North. His enemies would call him something considerably less flattering. But what everyone, friend and foe alike, would eventually have to admit was this: the man understood war on a level that made most of his contemporaries look like they were playing at it. The victories came quickly and with an almost unsettling ease. At Breitenfeld in 1631, Swedish forces dismantled an imperial army that was supposed to be unbeatable. At Rhein on the Lech in 1632, Gustavus forced a river crossing against fortified positions and killed one of the most feared imperial commanders in Europe. These weren't lucky wins. They were exhibitions. They were Gustavus showing the rest of the continent that he had figured something out, something fundamental about how war was supposed to work, that nobody else had quite grasped yet. But here's what the history books often miss when they tell this story. They talk about Swedish tactics, about cavalry charges and artillery placement, and the famous mobile guns that could keep pace with advancing infantry. All of that is real, and all of that matters. But underneath every one of those tactical innovations was something even more basic, something almost embarrassingly unglamorous. It was a logistics problem that Gustavus had solved when everyone else was still pretending it didn't exist. For centuries, and we mean centuries, not decades, The musket had been the defining infantry weapon of European warfare, and for those same centuries, reloading it had been an absolute nightmare. The standard process required a soldier to carry loose black powder in a flask or horn, measure out the correct charge by eye or by a pre-measured stopper, pour it down the barrel without spilling, then separately retrieve a lead ball, which might be slightly the wrong size for the barrel because nobody had bothered to standardize calibers across an army, ram both down with a rod, and then prime the firing pan, under perfect conditions, with a calm soldier who had done it 1,000 times. This took somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes. Under battlefield conditions, deafening noise, blinding smoke, the man next to you screaming as a musket ball takes off his arm. It took much longer. Worse, inconsistent powder measurements meant inconsistent shots. Too little powder, and the ball barely makes it out of the barrel. Too much powder, and you risk an overcharge that can split the weapon and take your hand with it. And if two soldiers in the same army were using muskets with different caliber bores, their ammunition wasn't interchangeable. You couldn't resupply easily. You couldn't train uniformly. Every single inconsistency compounded into battlefield chaos. Gustavus looked at this and did what great military minds do. He went back to first principles. Why were calibers different? Because nobody had made them standardize. Fix that. Why was powder measured loosely? Because nobody had pre-packaged it. Fix that. Why were the muskets themselves so heavy that soldiers needed forked rests to aim them? Because nobody had bothered to make them lighter. Fix that too. Swedish armories began producing a weapon lighter than anything European infantry had carried before. Without the weight, the forked rest disappeared, and with it a whole sequence of wasted time in the loading and aiming process. More importantly, those same armories began producing something radical in its simplicity: a tightly rolled paper tube containing a precise, pre-measured charge of black powder and exactly one lead ball, sized to match the standardized bore of the Swedish musket. The paper cartridge. Soldiers carried these in leather bandoliers across their chests, each loop holding a single cartridge, immediately accessible without any searching or fumbling. The loading process became, in the language of modern military training, a drill. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, insert the ball, ram the paper as wadding, prime the pan, present, fire. The entire sequence could be completed in 30 seconds. Some trained soldiers reportedly managed it faster. Think about what that means tactically. If one soldier can fire twice in the time it takes a traditionally equipped soldier to fire once, and if you have hundreds of soldiers, then you haven't just doubled your firepower. You've restructured the entire logic of infantry combat. You've changed what formations make sense, what the relationship between offense and defense looks like, and how you use your men across a battlefield. The tactical ripple effects were extraordinary. Traditional infantry formations had been deep, 8, 10, sometimes 12 ranks of men, because you needed that depth to maintain continuous fire while the front ranks reloaded. It was a slow rotation. With Swedish reloading speeds, Gustavus could thin those formations dramatically. At Lützen, Swedish infantry fought in formations as shallow as 3 ranks. 3 ranks. That meant the same number of men covered vastly more frontage. More of the battlefield was under fire at any given moment. Flanking became harder for the enemy because your line was simply wider, and because every rank was cycling through shots so much faster. The coordinated volley fire that Swedish units could produce was something their opponents genuinely struggled to comprehend in the chaos of combat. Gustavus also shifted the composition of his armies in ways that reflected this new reality. Traditional European armies at this period maintained ratios of roughly one musketer for every pikeman. The pike was considered essential, a hedge against cavalry charges, a way to hold a line when reloading left infantry vulnerable. But if you're reloading in 30 seconds instead of 4 minutes, your vulnerability window collapses. You still need pikemen, but you need far fewer of them. Swedish armies fielded musketeers and pikemen at roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. That is a fundamental restructuring of what an army is and how it fights. More guns, more fire, less waiting. This system was further integrated with mobile light artillery that Gustavus had developed. Guns light enough to be repositioned during a battle, and with cavalry tactics that stressed aggressive, shock-oriented charges rather than the fire and maneuver pistol tactics that were fashionable elsewhere. Together, combined arms working in synchronized layers, it was devastating. By the autumn of 1632, Gustavus had demonstrated all of this repeatedly, and his reputation had grown to something almost mythological among both his allies and his enemies. But the war wasn't over. The imperial side had regrouped around Albrecht von Wallenstein, one of the most capable commanders of the era, a man as brilliant in logistics and army building as he was mercurial in temperament. Wallenstein moved into Saxony, captured Leipzig, and began applying pressure to John George I, Sweden's Saxon ally, in a way that Gustavus could not ignore. To abandon Saxony would be to potentially unravel everything he had built. And then, on November 15th, Swedish scouts brought news that changed the calculus entirely. Wallenstein had detached a substantial cavalry force under his best subordinate, Pappenheim, to conduct operations elsewhere. For a brief window of time, the imperial army at Lützen was weaker than usual. Gustavus, never a commander who hesitated when opportunity appeared, ordered an immediate advance. The morning of November 16th did not cooperate. The fog that settled over the Saxon plain that day was extraordinary even by local standards. So thick, so persistent, that Lützen fog would pass into the German language as a phrase for impenetrable obscurity. The Swedish attack, planned for early morning, was delayed for hours while the mist held. Those hours cost Gustavus something he didn't know he was spending. Wallenstein used the time to frantically recall Pappenheim, to dig in along the road, to construct hasty but meaningful defensive positions. By the time the fog lifted enough for the Swedish advance to begin around 11 in the morning, the imperial army was no longer as exposed as the scouts had reported. What followed was one of the most brutal and consequential battles of the 17th century. The Swedish right wing, led by Gustavus himself, smashed into the imperial left with the coordinated ferocity that had become his signature. Infantry volleys, rolling and continuous, drove imperial musketeers back. The road was crossed. Wallenstein's flank was turned, and then Pappenheim arrived. His cavalry hit the Swedish line like a hammer, driving units back, creating chaos in formations that had been flowing forward. Even under this pressure, under cavalry attack, under renewed musket fire from imperial infantry that had rallied, Swedish soldiers were reloading in 30 seconds. The coordinated volley system didn't collapse. It bent, but it didn't break. Pappenheim himself was hit during his counterattack, a wound that would kill him before the day was out. And then, somewhere in the fog and the smoke and the screaming confusion of early afternoon, Gustavus Adolphus was killed, separated from his escort during a cavalry engagement, shot multiple times at close range. The Lion of the North fell from his horse and died before anyone who loved him could reach him. The news, when it spread through the Swedish ranks, could have ended the battle. It nearly did, but Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar-See's command rallied the infantry with a fury that bordered on the magnificent, and drove the Swedish line forward again with artillery brought up close and volleys that refused to stop. By nightfall, Wallenstein had retreated. The field was Sweden's. The guns were Sweden's. The victory, such as it was Sweden's. But Gustavus was dead, and that was the kind of loss that no tactical victory could balance. Here is the thing about great ideas. Though they do not die with the people who created them. The paper cartridge outlived Gustavus Adolphus by centuries. Swedish methods spread across European armies through the simple mechanism of imitation. If your enemy is outfiring you 2-1, you study how they're doing it, and you copy it. Standardized, pre-packaged ammunition became the foundational logic of firearms manufacture for the next 400 years, evolving through percussion caps and metallic cartridges all the way to the ammunition loaded into rifles today. Frederick the Great studied Gustavus. Napoleon's armies carried the inheritance of these ideas without ever quite knowing it. The lesson of Lützen. The lesson buried underneath the fog and the death and the blood is almost too simple. It is not the warrior who wins wars. It is the system behind the warrior. It is the standardized bore diameter. It is the pre-measured powder charge. It is the paper tube that turns a clumsy 4-minute process into a 30-second drill repeated thousands of times across a half-mile of battlefield. Gustavus Adolphus did not just give his soldiers a better way to reload a musket. He understood something that most commanders in history have failed to grasp. That war is, at its core, an industrial and logistical enterprise, and that the army which solves its logistics problems most completely will, almost always, be the army that wins. He transformed the act of loading a weapon from an improvised, inconsistent, panic-prone art form into a precise, repeatable, scalable science. And in doing so, with a piece of paper and a lead ball and a pre-measured charge of black powder, he changed the world.